I'd like to welcome the overflowing crowd to our June 16th televised portion of our work session. We're going to start with a budget update. Mr. Wagner.
Good morning, board members. I must say that this has been a very exciting budget preparation because as of last Tuesday, when I thought I had everything pretty much finalized, all of a sudden I was given some updated information from the Florida School Boards Association, so I went in and made some changes. And what I found was, and I'll go through them, that I changed certain parts of the verbiage and neglected on some other parts on the verbiage. But anyway, I'll go through there. We are hoping, what the rumor mill is that the education budget will be finalized today, and that sometime this evening the Florida Education Finance Program runs that they do, which will then give us our base student allocation and millage rates and so forth, will be on the desks of the House and Senate as of this evening. So when we get that, then I think personally we're pretty close from everything I've been monitoring, but we'll then get some more definitive details because they basically have to everything to the members of both chambers today. So there's a 72-hour cooling off period so they can vote on the budget on Friday when the session is to end. So with that said, in my first paragraph there, I basically talk about, there not being any consensus at this point. What I've built in is the original Senate budget had about 3.5% to 4% additional money in it. I had actually reduced that in what I've done right now as of Tuesday to take 1% out, so basically have about 3% budgeted in there. And what I was told as of yesterday is that they do believe we'll have a 3% increase in education funding. So I'm hoping that we'll be pretty close. The other thing that we found out very late, last Tuesday, was that they had revised the enrollment estimates. And basically they now have 30,000 additional students statewide in there based on the latest, the fourth calculation, comparing it to the fourth calculation to what they're now putting in there. So by putting a student growth of about 30,000 students, I believe a proration, there might be still a little one, but nothing as large as we received this year because they only had roughly 15,000 students, and we did come in closer to a 25,000 student increase. So that's some good news. The other thing that I've built into our budget is, I know it's been bumped up to the Senate President and the Speaker of the House, about on the 1.5 capital millage, including language or adding language that we can now buy computer software licenses. And if they do that, that will definitely help our general operating fund, because those, as they call them, enterprise-wide site licenses, we can now use our capital transfer to help out with that expenditure. And that area is growing all the time because the industry is going more and more to site licenses as everything goes into, as they call it, the cloud as far as computer programming. So that's basically how I've changed the revenues. In the appropriation portion of the budget, I've tried to make sure I have what I would call a worst case scenario for 2015-16. So not knowing what the base student allocation will be, but our negotiated settlement that we did in December of last year, or actually November of last year, we included that if the base student allocation exceeded $4,164 per student, we would put a 1.25% cost of living on the salary schedules. So right now, because I do not have what our base student allocation will be, I went ahead, because I think it's going to be very close to that 4,164, but I don't really have the final figures, so I went ahead and budgeted that as a line item in the salary budget. Also in the salary budget line item, there's additionally 78 additional staff associated with our student growth. And also we've had some reduction in federal funding, so we've had to put some positions that were being funded from the federal funds previously into the operating fund that were necessary to keep. In the benefit area, we've increased group health by the 10% as an estimate. And, of course, the benefits have gone up because we have additional staff in the salary line item. In the purchase services for charter schools, we have an estimated increase of 485 students in there. So that will make the purchase service line item for charter schools increase. And then, of course, I've also had to change the revenue per student based on my best estimate or our best estimate of what the legislature will finalize the base student allocation on. In purchase services for district services, we've put a 2% increase of cost of services in there and an additional amount in there for security screening that will run through the purchase services area. And this is really, we talked about it in prior workshops, this is additional screening for the PALS volunteers. Energy services, I've kept that based on the cost of oil remaining below $100 per barrel. Your material and supplies area, and this is where your instructional materials go through for textbooks and those related items. I'm anticipating we'll spend the total categorical instructional material allocation plus the carry forward. So as we look at the dollar amounts of materials and supplies, you'll see that increases. And then in capital outlay and other expenses, I just have a 2% increase. So before we actually go into the 15-16 budget, I have, starting on page 2, a comparison of what was presented at your budget work session on May 19th, 2015, and what we have updated based on operations through May 31st, 2015. So in the revenue and transfers in line, you can see very basically no change. There is a minor change in the estimated transfer in from other funds, which is your capital fund, just a very minor amount of reduction of $14,218. Getting into the appropriation area, because again we have the hiring freeze in effect, and we look at what positions are mandatory to be posted. As of operations May 31st, 2015, we had basically 260 vacant positions in the general fund, and so that's accruing additional savings in the salary area, and that same trend hits the employee benefits because your Social Security and your retirement that you're paying is less there also.
This 260, how are we going to handle those positions?
In staffing, in fact, they're posted now, and because we've went through the staffing process, and some of those positions were filled by transfers within the surplus and process, so they all now are out there being posted, and principals are out there doing interviewing and so forth. So I believe we're a little bit earlier in the process than maybe some other districts. So hopefully we'll have a little bit of a leg up on getting qualified candidates.
But we're not going to fill those positions with long-term subs.
No, we're not. These were merely as the school year came to an end, when we had vacancies occur, I made a decision, frankly, it didn't make sense to have a new hire. They're not there yet in terms of that staffing process, so we went with subs for the remainder of the year, and many of these were also classified positions with the same rationale. But all positions have been posted, and as long as we find qualified candidates, we will be filling those positions. And I'll be able to report once we kind of get through the bubble of hiring over the summer what the status is, because although we'll have some flexibility with some certification areas where we may have some individuals out of field, we're going to be very cautious in trying to achieve certified individuals to fill our teaching positions.
So when you say that these figures over here are not correct because you're saying that we have 260 vacant positions, so those positions will be filled, so therefore these line items are not accurate. Is that correct?
Well, no, you got to remember, right now we're looking at the 14-15, the current fiscal year. We're not looking at
so
next
you're
year.
saying as a result of there were 260. Okay.
Right.
All right. Thank
Because
you.
really what I'm doing right now is just updating you where I believe we're going to come in at for this fiscal year as of June 30th, 2015. So that's what I'm going through right now. But yeah, when we move into the next year's budget, then we'll move into that, and you'll see the difference there. Yeah. And then in Purchase Services District, the major increase between what I presented to you in May 19th and what I'm presenting now is the major increases in the line item of technology site licenses, because that continues to have more and more that we're putting into that. So that, based on results of operations through May 31st, what I'm projecting us to end with come June 30th, 2015, is $351,000 above what I gave you in the last work session. Then as far as charter schools, they are now showing a projected decrease. This is really based upon when we received the proration of funds. They receive that same proration downward of funding. So theirs is reducing their projection by $232,000 as of June 30th, 2015. And again, that's because when the state does do a proration of funding, they are to receive basically 95%, or really they receive more than that because it's capped on the administration fee. But they're to receive their proration or portion of the FEFP. So that's why that goes down, because our FEFP went down. Energy services, that decrease is based upon our fuel costs remaining below what was originally budgeted last year, and my projection still shows a favorable trend as of June 30th, 2015. Materials and supplies, this is showing a decrease from what I presented to you May 19th of $574,000. Again, this is all based upon our trending through May 31st, 2015. Capital outlay, a slight decrease there of $12,446. Other expenses within dues and fees, we've seen an increase in that line item, and that is going up by, from what I presented to you last May till now, by $159,000. So overall, when you get to your total appropriations for, again, this year, what I'm estimating for this current fiscal year will be below what I presented to you in May by $749,000. Now, in the gross fund balance and unassigned fund balance changes, this is where I mentioned earlier I had a problem with the parentheses, and that's in the very bottom on fund balance. And
that's a positive, right?
Yes, and that's a positive, correct. And so anyway, your beginning gross fund balance, of course, stayed the same. Your revenues and transfers in did decrease some. Your appropriation transfers decreased by the $749,000. So what that, when you net the decrease in revenues and decrease in appropriations, That actually nets our gross fund balance going up by $735,586 projected as of June 30th, 2015. And as far as our unassigned fund balance, it would go up by the same dollar amount, the $735,000. So our percentage of unassigned fund balance is a percentage of appropriations. What I presented as of back in May was 8.51%, and it is now 8.71%, what we're projecting for the end of this fiscal year that will be ending very shortly.
So the drawdown for this fiscal year from that fund is about $4 million.
Correct.
I have a question. And I think this may be another correction, and that's under materials and supplies. It starts out, the decrease is based on the results of operations through May 31st. Then it says the majority of the increase is consumable supplies will be above. I mean, shouldn't that be decrease and below?
Correct, right.
Boy, I was awake when I was reading this one.
and I'll have to be quite frank with you because of the what's going on up in Tallahassee.
You've been distracted.
Well, it's been a little more difficult than normal. So anyway, and also my proofreaders, they've been off on other tangents also, and unfortunately that did not get caught. So anyway.
Well, we're here to keep an eye on you.
Yes, and I do thank you for that, by the way. The more eyes looking at, the better we have. And then on page 4 is the chart that I have showing the beginning unassigned fund balance as compared to our ending unassigned fund balance. And you can see over the years how we've been getting much, much closer on what we budget as a beginning unassigned fund balance to what we're ending. This year probably will be one of the closest years as to looking at what we had as a beginning unassigned fund balance to the ending unassigned. Our beginning budget had an 8.94%, and right now we're at 8.71%. So you can see we're very close on percentages. Going back into the early 2000s, the reason you see a big difference in percentages is the hiring freeze was not budgeted as a line item in those early years, and we actually budgeted to fill all positions. Where now, because we're trying to be much closer on what we're going to end up at, we're budgeting the hiring freeze in there, and that's the major difference why you see us getting much closer, because it began getting really much closer in 2012, 13, and so that's the reason for that.
I think some of the largest gap we had, I think, goes back to 2002 when we were looking at what we're going to do with the referendum dollars and when we were getting more money in.
Right.
And I think it was a good thing that we didn't spend all that we saved, because we weathered the storm because of that.
Right. Yeah, it was also not only the way we did the appropriations side, but you're correct on the revenue side, how we were being conservative on what we were using those revenues for. Okay, then I'll move on to our 2015-16 estimate, our estimate for next year. And actually, the last time we talked about what the estimate would be for 2015-16 was April 21st of 2015, because our last work session, because of the uncertainty, we only looked at the current year. We didn't look at the next year because we really didn't feel we had enough data to give a good analysis. The state amount that we presented back on April 21st, and this was actually based on a Senate run and a House run, that the House was like March 31st, 2015, and the Senate run was April 1st of 2015. And I used their numbers, and I actually used the Senate run for what I presented back on April 21st. So based on that, I had us set on state dollars. And by the way, you'll see there's no change in federal direct because this time I don't see that changing from what we originally presented back in April. But the state, now that we are seeing that we believe it's going to be a 3% increase, back when I used the Senate back then, it was above a 3% increase. So I believe we're going to, our state dollars will be about 704,000 below what we had in the original estimate there. Now, the other thing that has happened since we discussed everything in April is the property appraiser released the preliminary tax roll figures, and he did that on June 1st. And the preliminary tax roll figures went up above what we were using based on what the House and Senate had. So the preliminary tax roll will bring in about 605,000 above what we had projected based on our data as of April 21st. And again, on the tax roll, we'll get a final certification on or about July 1, 2015. And that'll be the number that'll be sent up to the Department of Revenue for them to verify, and then they will send that off to the Florida Department of Education for them to compute our millage rates for our required local effort. And they have to release that to the school districts by July 17th. So I'll have the actual required local effort millage rate. And of course, we know what our other millage rates will be, but that is the one millage rate we don't have until actually July 17th. In your transfers in from other funds, I've went ahead and anticipated that it will be agreed upon that we can use or pay for site licenses out of the capital fund, which will be in the capital transfer. So I've bumped that up by $1.2 million. Now that could change because we have to evaluate the site licenses that are being paid out of the general fund right now as to which site licenses will qualify to use the capital funds. And I think I have a question.
But that's not new money. That's taking it out of the capital and putting it into the operating.
That's 100% right. That is not new money. It is just taking it from one pocket and putting it into the other pocket. That's correct.
The numbers on pages 5 and 6, are they the projections from 2014-15, or are we talking 2015-2016?
2015-16.
All right.
And I'm sorry that did not get updated.
You just.
I'll tell you, we really.
I'm keeping you honest here.
Yeah.
And it doesn't take much to confuse me, but.
Yes, that should have.
But I keep flagging these little things for you.
Yeah, and I do thank you.
Thank you.
And but yeah, that's consistent. How about that? I don't believe that got by. But anyway.
Frank. And we won't have another meeting until the 21st of July.
That's correct.
When you get solid answers on some of these things, will we send that out to us before that, or will we wait?
No, I can, especially if something's what I would consider to be material in nature.
Right.
We will notify you as we get that data.
Yep.
We won't come on July 21st and say, well, we thought we were going to use and we're going to use 10 million.
We haven't been in this situation before, so usually we have the accurate numbers and we're all set, but I'm still a little unsure of some of these numbers,
Oh, you're not the only one.
But look at the bright side. Since they're starting session next year in January, we might very well have the numbers by the 1st of June. Maybe.
So, but no, that's a very good point. If there are any material changes, we'll make sure you're all notified of what those changes are. Because I don't want to come on July 21st and have material changes and not having the board members, because I've been here too long to do something like that.
Well, I think another thing I'd like to be made aware of when they shut this down is I know they're supposed to be working on the budget, but I know they're trying to sneak in policy issues too. something like the uniforms and a couple of other things. If any of those policy changes that they sneak into the proviso language, and what's the other one they do? The implementing bill. And I really think we need to read those over with a fine-tooth comb, because maybe they'll be upfront about what they did. But from my experience, they may not be.
Right.
In speaking with Ruth last night, they're very aware of what they're trying to do. So if we're not up to it, FSBA will be notifying us, because
Right.
they're watching that stuff.
Yes.
In fact, actually, the conference that I'm attending this week, Ruth Melton will be there tomorrow to give us her latest updates. So anyway, which will be very interesting. So with that said, total revenues and transfers in from what I presented back in April to what's presented now for next year shows an increase of $1.1 million.
And that's mainly transferring it in from capital.
Correct. That's the major increase. That's correct. Because really your increase in the tax roll and the decrease in the state dollars sort of offset each other. It's really the the transfer in from capital that's the increase.
Yeah. Well, I'm looking at the next presentation and saying, okay.
I know you're waiting for your capital presentation, or anticipation of that. But okay, then in appropriations and transfers out, the salary line item I'm projecting to go up by $305,000 from what I presented back in April for next year. And basically what came to my attention was I was looking at the large number of people that will be leaving and the payouts that they still are entitled to. So I upped basically the terminal leave pay.
Would you explain what that terminal leave pay is that's going to cost us?
That's unused vacation time, or if they haven't taken sick days up to 180 that they can be paid, and that's in statute.
Mm-hmm.
That then they can take whatever number of sick days they haven't taken.
So these are sick days that
Right.
they haven't taken. Thank you.
Right. Then the employee benefits, I do have that projected to go down a little bit, and that's because on the retirement rates, and again, I know this is another area that there's uncertainty in, but they have the basic member rate going down, which is the bulk of our people. They do have an actuarial, though, increase, but it's not enough to offset the decrease on the regular member FRS. So
that's another point I want to make. And yes, while the rate might decrease by 0.5%, if you turn to page 11, back in 2011, 2012, our FRS retirement dropped considerably because employees put 3% in.
correct.
And it stayed low again, the 2012, but then in 2013, 2014, and now 2015, 16, it's right back up there. That 3% that the employees were putting in, didn't that go into the retirement pool
Yes,
to
it
keep
is.
our low, or did it just go into general revenue?
Oh no, it's staying within the FRS fund. What is the major increase now is what they call the actuarial liability.
But I thought stocks are up, so that liability should go down.
And that's a very good point. And not being an expert on what they're doing with the FRS system and how they're coming up with these rates, if you use common sense, as you're doing right there, you would be thinking that the rates should not be going up for what they call this actuarial liability, but they are. So, and but that is a good question that we can, when we start to get final numbers, and we can go into the FRS website, and they are very transparent on their earnings and on how they're coming up with these actuarial.
Well, I had heard some teachers complain that the retirement, the 3% that they were doing, was going right into the general revenue, and the thought was that it was reducing the amount that we would be paying by the same amount, but it doesn't seem to be doing that.
No, it's going into the Florida retirement system. In fact, when these people retire that have contributed to 3%, they will see on their retirement statements another box that'll have how much were their employee contributions. So it'll be very transparent there. But no, it is staying.
Yeah, but it didn't reduce ours by the same amount across. They did it for 2 years, but not across the board.
Right, because again, they then began up in the rate. Right. Okay. So we're now going to move on to page 6. On purchase services direct, I revised that number for last year up by $219,000, and that's revising the estimate for 2015-16 based on what we're coming in at for this current year. And so then on charter schools, I do have them going up a little bit from what I presented based in April to now, and that increase is really big because of our tax roll going up, and we do allow them to share in our voted millage. So the most of that $90,000 is because of the voted millage going up.
There's an item on the budget. I mean, on the vote today on our agenda that talks about adding another school to this. Are those numbers included in this, or how much that number would be?
They are included in this right now.
They are included right now.
They are included right now.
And do you know what that number off? Approximately, I'm not going to hold you to.
I believe on the voted millage, it's somewhere in the 40,000.
Okay, thank you.
But again, that is an attachment. Then it breaks it down between the 1.5 mil and the voted. And just for clarification, right now in the workshop, that includes all the students that are projected for Englewood. So
this projection includes all, not just Sarasota County?
Correct. Because at the time, I didn't know exactly what the decision will be. So I just wanted to clarify that. Okay. So.
And that because that had been the original calculation, even though the motion is suggesting that it would only be for Sarasota County, that reflects all students, the amount. So it's easy, though, to calculate or estimate what the reduced amount would be, about 50%.
Right. Okay, then in energy services, not much change there at all, only a $4,000 change from what we estimated back in April. Materials and supplies, we're estimating schools will have less carry forward based on what we're seeing through May 31st. So that reduction in a reduction of $189,000 in materials and supplies is really estimating that schools will have less money to carry forward to spend for materials and supplies in 2015-16. Capital outlay, we're revising the estimate for 2015-16 down by $140,000, and that's again based on what we see as a trend for this current school year. And then other expenses, again, there are additional things that are going into the dues and fees line item, and based on our experience for this year, I'm now revising the 2015-16 budget up by $163,000 for the other expenses, which is basically dues and fees is the main line item in there.
And what are those dues and fees?
They're a combination of things. Sometimes on different computer software, there are things that are considered dues and fees that get costed dues and fees rather than computer software. So it's a wide range, but I'd have to say it's mainly in that area.
Under materials and supplies, the state textbooks is dramatically increasing. Is that no increase. Is it? Am I looking at that incorrectly? Under state textbooks, under material and supplies.
Right, correct, they are.
It's going from 2.5 to 4.9.
That's correct.
And do we know, is that because of the electronic licensing purposes, or do we know what that's
Yes,
related to?
what I've done is, for right now, I didn't have a real good breakdown as to how much will be software licenses, and so I put the whole amount in the textbook allocation there.
Also, we are moving forward with K-12 math adoption, which is an expensive adoption. So we're really scraping the barrel to be able to pull that off across all grade levels, but feel it's really important that our teachers have those aligned resources to the new standards. So rather than spread it out for multiple years, we're just biting the bullet and trying to do it all in 1 year.
And we did not have those this past year, did we?
No, and we were trying to make do with some other resources that made planning more challenging for our teachers. So we felt, along with the software license that will support that aligned instruction, it was also to give them their basic textbook aligned more closely so that they don't have the challenges of trying to pull from other resources for their planning.
Okay, and then finally on transfers out to the self-insurance fund, we're going to see a slight increase in the transfer to the self-insurance fund for the, basically it goes into the general liability and auto account that we're self-insured on. And it's based on Aon Risk Solutions recommendations, so it's not much of, but it's $27,000. So again, from what I presented on your appropriations back in April for next year to what I'm now reprojecting based on facts we have now, I'm increasing your appropriations for next year by $209,000. Going down into your gross fund balance and unassigned fund balance changes, I believe your beginning gross fund balance as of July 1, 2015 will be $46,978,999, and for this coming year. And then I have the revenues and transfers in. Again, I compare what I had as back in April to what is now projected for June. And as we discussed earlier, the revenues and transfers in, that $1,000,001 increase is really mainly money being exchanged from the capital fund to this fund, which again is not new money to the total budget, but it's new money to the general operating fund. And then we have the appropriations going up by $209,000. So your ending gross fund balance as of June 30th, 2016 would now be estimated to go up by close to $1 million, or $914,212. So an ending gross fund balance as of June 30th, 2016 of $45,290,000 or $290,000, and an unassigned fund balance of $33,266,000, or as far as a percentage to appropriations and transfers out, 7.94% as of June 30th, 2016.
Couple things, Al. When we look at what we're saying, the bottom line here is you have factored in this budget the 1.25% COLA.
Correct.
But you haven't factored in any raises whatsoever other than that.
No, that's correct.
Okay. The other question I had was on our health insurance. You have a 10% increase. Are you just rolling that on what you would expect to pay additionally to Blue Cross Blue Shield for 2016?
That's correct.
And where are we at with self-insurance on health insurance?
Well, we're moving forward. Hard to predict, though, how in that transition what will be the
Will there
increase.
be any savings?
Will there be any savings year one as we transfer in? And hard to project at this point, but it is our intent to be prepared to have a plan to put forth the board that would move us to self-insurance.
Thanks.
By the beginning of the year?
That's the plan.
Because that's when our policy renews, right?
In January. Yes, when you say beginning, it's beginning of the, not
Calendar.
the school year, but the calendar year. Yes.
And then I have the actual detailed individual figures attached. And on the page 7 there of the detailed figures, you can see that if you go down right above the title fund balance, where it says excess deficiency of revenues and transfers over expenditures, that line item has, by year, going back to 2012-13, that we, in 2012-13, we brought the fund balance down by $10.5 million. That was one of the highest years, and that was when we were enduring some of trying to keep our programs intact with reduced resources. Then in 13-14, we used roughly $2.6 million. This year's original budget was to use $3.4 million. We amended the budget to use $4 million, and now it looks like we're going to use 3.9 or very close to that $4 million. So it looks like we're staying pretty close to that for this current year. And then a preliminary budget for next year of using 1.68 or almost 1.7 million. And it does contain the factors that Mr. Kovach mentioned about the 1.25% COLA and the increase in the health insurance and also the additional staff for student growth. And again, we'll have to see how that changes based when we get the actual FEFP, Florida Education Finance Program detail, to see how that will change. And of course, I do anticipate normally the tax roll, when the property appraiser certifies it, normally goes up a little bit more than what he does as a preliminary in June. So we still have a lot of uncertainties, and but again, as we get these uncertainties, we find out what they are, we'll definitely be keeping everybody informed as to what the bottom line is.
Sure.
What about the referendum? The $1 million, do we expect that to go up?
Yes, that will, because the tax roll is going up. In fact, if you go to page 8, and you go down to local, you'll see that the voted school tax is the third line item under local. And for this current year, we believe it's going to bring in $45.5 million. And with I'm using the preliminary tax roll, it would go up to $48.2 million. So you can see it is increasing. Back in 2012-13, you can see it was down at $40 million. That's at $1 million level. So,
but I would guess, Al, that there's two factors there: the increase in the value of property and the increase in construction of new homes and new properties.
That's 100% right. We've added an awful lot of new construction. Property values have went up some, but I actually get from the property appraiser a breakout as new construction versus just the overall tax roll going up. So I'll provide that detail to you.
Shirley?
Yes, I'm glad to see that the budget is coming in closer to what the appropriations and the income is. Because I know back in 2012 there was one board member who especially had heartburn over continuing to project those deficit spendings, and we agreed with him to see that come down. Hopefully, if we switch to the self-insured, we can see some of those savings coming back to us, and perhaps instead of paying it to an insurance company, we can turn around and help our employees who have gone for so long without increases. And it looks like, we're bare bonesing it again this year. So I'm glad to see that we're coming in closer, and I see the light at the end of the tunnel on that.
Right. No,
I'd hope so, since the recession ended about 5 years ago.
With that, unless there's, I know we've used up most of the 45 minutes, so we have another presentation, but if there's anything else, I can entertain those questions or...
Caroline?
I don't have a question, Al, but I'd like to thank you again. I mean, I don't know what we're going to do. I know you're in drop, and I don't know what we're going to do without you, because you know the history, and you bring the history forward. So whenever, and with these little scribners, that it's the first time that I can remember in all these years that you ever even had a scribner change. So I want to thank you and your staff again for the great work that you do to keep this district on target.
Well, thank you very much. But it is a team effort, and my team has been short one person, and unfortunately the review process just didn't get what it should have been this past time. So anyway.
A follow-up on the comment I made before, perhaps you might want to rethink your your proclamation you made a few months ago and actually stay on and watch that deficit go away. You'll miss it when it happens, if it happens. And you've helped push us there, so maybe you want to ride that train all the way.
Anything else for Al?
No, Al is done. Thank you very much, board members.
Okay, we'll move on to Scott Lempe, and going to talk about growth. Not sure about the management part, Scott, but we'll talk about the growth.
Everybody ready? Okay, well, thank you very much for the opportunity to talk about what I think is going to be a pretty exciting topic, at least a thought-provoking topic. This is a conversation that's gone on over time, but really started in earnest in the fall of last year when we came to the board and talked about how the dynamic relative to growth in this community was changing pretty dramatically, that we really didn't have a good handle on where that was going to take us. And we asked the board for permission to go out into the industry, look for somebody who does these kinds of things for a living, and solicit some help relative to understanding what current development looks like in Sarasota County, what that development might mean to us in terms of the number of kids that can come out of those schools, and ultimately what it means to us in terms of our equation of capacity versus enrollment. So we went out in the industry. We went through an RFP process. We were really lucky to hire Tyndall Oliver to kind of help us understand some of this data. We then, I guess when we brought you our CIP in the winter of 2014, we kind of reiterated those comments that the CIP has a lot of data in it, a lot of which is based on information that we don't completely understand yet relative to where growth in our county is taking us.
CIP is Capital Improvement Plan.
Yes, ma'am. So we've spent some time looking at the information. You'll see late in this presentation that this is the first of what we hope will be several conversations with the board about growth and growth management and the implications on schools. What I think we hope to do today are a couple of things. Number one is give you a very preliminary peek into the numbers relative to growth. What do we think is happening around Sarasota County, and what are the implications of that growth on schools and school capacity? And then second, based on that preliminary look at the data, understanding we're going to come back to you probably in August and have the second conversation on what's not there. What questions do we generate from you? What are the holes in the analysis so that we know we have a couple of months to plug those holes? So I think those are kind of our two big goals today is, number one, just a peek to the preliminary data, take a look at it, ask questions, and then if there are things that aren't there that you would like to see there, you could give us a course correction. So with that as a quick introduction, with us today are two members of the Tyndall Oliver firm. I almost used the term workhorse, but that would imply the wrong thing. The person who has done the heavy lifting on this project is Nilgan Kemp. Nilgan is the Director of Facility Planning and Finance for Tyndall Oliver, and directly to my left, Mr. Steve Tyndall, who's kind of the principal in charge on this project. So I'm going to turn the microphone over to Steve and let he and Nilgan kind of introduce you to. We have the presentation in front of you in hard copy, and we've also got it up on the screens if that's easier for you to see and for the viewing public to see. Steve? Sure. I can drive if you just. Or you want to drive?
Yeah. As you said, Nilgren will be giving majority of the presentation, and I'll chime in when requested. A couple of really quick comments, I guess, in terms of her presentation. Hopefully you'll get a kind of a strategic overview of your county. I think what's really helpful and what we're going to show you is what rate you're growing compared to other counties, both in terms of population and housing, and also how many students you add every time you add a home, and the relative numbers that you're experiencing versus other communities, and you can see at least what kind of level of intensity you have in terms of growth, and then a perspective of where growth's going to occur, and finally the rate of growth, which we'll talk a lot about in terms of what to use in terms of planning purposes. So the other comment I'll make is I think you'll see that we zero in on the elementary schools versus the middle schools and high school, which is an issue. And the final thing I'd like to comment is that we do public facility planning for all the public facilities, and there's two that are extremely expensive. It's transportation and schools. When we add up all the assets in a community, the transportation schools assets add up to about 85% of what a county owns. They are expensive, and the reason everybody talks about roads and schools is it's expensive. It really is in terms of the capital outlay. And, of course, the school system is also one of the bigger operators, too. So with that perspective, hopefully what you'll see is a presentation that gives you that big overview in terms of where you are strategically and some issues you'll be facing.
Okay, good morning. I'll try that. Maybe. No?
How about I drive?
Okay. There it is. Okay. So, yeah, we have a brief background and then go into the findings and then talk a little bit about the next steps. Yeah. There it is. Okay, so we are just coming out of one of the largest economic downturns, and during that time, we didn't have to have the pressure of having new students. But now that the recovery period started, we are starting to experience that growth again. And so the school board was interested in a growth management plan addressing these type of issues and plan for it. Maybe. Thank you. So the purpose of, again, today's meeting is to share with you the initial results that address the future growth levels, the timing, location. Within that, there's student generation analysis conducted that feeds into it, and a little bit about start discussing ability to accommodate new students, whether building new schools, the location of them, and so on. As part of this presentation, this process, a couple things to keep in mind from a policy perspective is use of portables, to what extent, and also the possible redistricting. So far, the analysis we will show you today assumes is all based on permanent capacity, and also it does not assume any redistricting. Looks at each attendance boundary on its own. Thank you. These are a few acronyms, like a sort of a cheat sheet to have you in front of you in case we start using them. But and then okay, so the findings, let's start with that. Our general methodology approach is we look at the population data and any projections available. We look at both historical, we look at MPO's long-range transportation plan, any kind of a BEBR, Bureau of Economic and Business from the University of Florida, any kind of projections that are the counties already using. From that, we come up with a housing unit estimate over the next 25 years, 10 to 25 years. And those housing units estimates are compared to upcoming developments, what they are saying they're going to build, and so on. At the same time, we look at student generation rates, again, a historical trend, as well as the current addresses, matching the current addresses with the property data. So come up with a generation rate of existing all homes and new homes that are being recently built. So taking the units and the generation rate gives us the estimate for new students at elementary, middle, high level. So that's basically, in a nutshell, the general approach. This chart shows the history of population growth for Sarasota County and compares to Florida. So as you'll see, is in 90s, 20s, the growth rate was much higher, and now it's tapering down. Now, the thing to be mindful of here is the growth rate itself, of course, is affected by how large the base is. The fact that the rate is decreasing is partially because the base is bigger, so the percentage is smaller. So a better way of looking at this is how many students were being added and what's being expected in the future. So when we look at the 1990 to about 2007, 2008, on average, the district was adding about 700 students per year. And when we look at the future, we are saying maybe it's going to be 400 to 500 is probably a good number for planning purposes. So there's a decrease, but there's still new students to plan for. This chart shows your student generation rate compared to in a different county where the demographics are different, and it basically ties it to age distribution. So here on the right, in red, we show Sarasota County, and the largest age groups are those between the 60 to 70 years of age. This doesn't have it. Well, doesn't matter. And on the left, you have a county with a higher generation rate, and their population is much younger, and their largest group is in their 20s. So that basically that age distribution is driving your student generation to some extent. And the good news is it takes 5 homes to generate 1 student in Sarasota County, whereas in a faster growing counties, it's maybe only 2.5 homes generating 1 student. So you have some time to plan for it, and you have a little bit of a flexibility, but of course they are still coming, so it's not. Go ahead.
Can you repeat that stat that you just said as far as?
They're taking, student generation rate is 0.2 in Sarasota County. That means 5 homes are generating 1 student.
Okay.
Whereas we picked one of the higher counties. On average, in Florida, we see about 0.3. So Orange County is one of the higher counties. In their case, it's twice the rate. So 2.5 homes is generating 1 student. So
that's important, because the two things you'll find is if you're growing at 1% and Orange County is growing at 2%, twice the rate, and they got twice as many kids per home, they're adding 4 kids for every one you're adding. So it just shows you the order of magnitude that you're going to hear good news and bad news. The good news is you get your growth rate's not really high compared to the statewide average, and your student generation rate's nowhere near as high as some of the average ones. So that gives you some flexibility in dealing with a very costly program, which is the school system.
I found it surprising that one of the lowest age brackets we had was the 20 to 30. And then, of course, 30 to 40 is down there, too. But 20 to 30 is where you expect starting to have families, and 30 to 40 we'd have parents. But I was surprised how low the 20 to 30, that's down there between 0 and 10.
yeah.
So
if you take Sarasota, Manatee, and Charlotte, Manatee is much younger, and Sarasota and Charlotte's much older, and Manatee's sitting right between you. So there's a lot of the port, economics, urban development. There's a lot of reasons for the demographics, but that is your current demographics, even though the trend is seeing what they call a double bubble, the young people moving down here and creating that in urban areas. So far, you're not facing that like some of the other counties are.
So the population trends and the generation rates gives us the overall magnitude number of students, and for the location of it, we look at the planned developments. So this map is just to help you orient yourself with the upcoming major developments. It's not everything, but it's the primary ones. And we'll use that again to determine the location of the students.
it doesn't show much growth in the Northport area, or you just don't know what's happening, or there is no big pushes down there? Or?
That's one area we're going to show as an area to watch. These are large-scale developments, but Northport has all the pre-platted lots, so they can instantly build quite a bit units. It wouldn't be one single developer building it, so that's why it's not popping. But you'll see a circle around to say, "Watch out." this is using the population projections. This is sort of a trend of showing the projected students over the next 25 years, and in total is adding up to 13,000 students the whole time period. And this is also the aggressive student generation rate. This is absolute high end, just sort of give you a magnitude. Now, when we take the students and look at the school capacity available, there are, of course, two different measures. And one is FISH, and that's the definition by the Department of Education. And the other one is the program that's based on actual use. And right now, the school district's adopted standard is based on program capacity. So when we compare the capacity in terms of program versus FISH, program is about, right now, in the current inventory, is about 85% of FISH. So if the program is the actual use, we are automatically losing about 15% capacity. And high school is closer, it's about 97.
I just want to make sure that everybody understands this, because it's an important dynamic in this whole conversation, the difference between program and FISH. So let me belabor it just a little bit. If you think about, I'll use elementary as an example. Think about an elementary school. FISH is an acronym, Florida Inventory of Schoolhouses, and it essentially says, here's how many seats are in this school. So we'd go to an Atwater Elementary School, for example, and you see that there are 970 or so, 1,000 student stations in that school. To get to 100%, that would mean that there'd be a student in every chair all the time. 970 kids, every chair is full all the time. But if you think about how an elementary school operates, those students are going to lunch, they're going to specials, they're going to lab, and so there are times when those kids are not in that classroom. And what we're not doing, and have done, for example, at the high school level, is we're not moving another class of kids into that classroom while those kids are at specials. It is their homeroom. You know, Mrs. Smith's class is room 8124, and if Mrs. Smith isn't in there, nobody is. And so that drives you to a utilization rate, if FISH is your measure, to something less than 100%, because there are times when that classroom is empty. Does that difference make sense? It's subtle but really important in the dialogue.
I think it's real important, but there's also another thing that was afoot in the legislature this year, and this was the fact that they were going to open up all schools to all students in all counties. So if you lived in Miami and had a helicopter, you could come to Pineview. So that is of concern, because nowhere in the proposed legislation did it state whether they were using FISH or program. And so those are the little nuances that we all have to be careful of, because I'm hearing those will come back to haunt us next year.
Also important to know that that FISH is probably a much more popular measure of capacity around this state than program is. We're a little bit out there on an island as we use program. And frankly, I would tell you that if you said we're going to use FISH, but we know that we can only get to 85% of our FISH capacity, you get to the same ultimate number. But just know that program is what you've adopted in their interlocal agreement on school facility planning. It's just a little different than what's happening in most other counties.
You can, just to piggyback again on what Scott said, you can get to the same level of service standard using FISH capacity. You would just change your level of service standard. Our current program capacity is 105%. If we changed to a level of service standard of FISH capacity, we would decrease it to the 85%. That accounts for that 15% utilization that we know at an elementary or middle school we can't utilize. So you can, like Scott said, you can get to the same place with your level of service standard and make that cross-county relationship. You just have to change the way we measure our level of service standard.
You say we're the only ones who use the program standard. When other counties use the FISH capacity, what percentage of FISH capacity do they normally use, or do you know that?
It varies. If you wanted that information, we could certainly do the research and bring it back to you for the August meeting. But it varies. Not every. It depends on the county.
Thank you.
So for our analysis for planning purposes, we worked with staff and used 85% for elementary, 90% for middle, and 95% for high. These tables provide information on the timing of school construction. So basically, it provides two scenarios. The first column in each, elementary, middle, high category is the least conservative or most however you look at it, it takes the lower end of the student generation rate and assumes fish capacity. So it says we have the most available capacity is assumed against the lowest generation rate. So this is the minimum you would have to build, if you are able to use the capacity very efficiently and you don't have as much generation. The second scenario is the high end, basically saying the student generation will be higher and we have program capacity as schools. We are not able to use every seat as much as the fish claims that we can. So with these variables, in the case of elementaries, over the next 25 years, we are estimating that district will need about 5 to 7 schools. And of those, about 2 to 4 of them is in the first 10 years. So that's the area that you'll see, again, there's most urgency. In the case of middle school, it's 1 to 2 schools will seem to be sufficient at this time. And then high school, the same thing, 1 to 2 schools. And there's a little bit, in both cases, there's a little bit more time. It's not as pressuring right now. So to determine where these students are going to show up and which attendance boundaries will experience the most growth, again, we looked at the development locations. And this map shows as the circle gets bigger and more red, it indicates more density of new students.
Yeah, maybe just 1 second. That what we did, again, remember that picture showed where all development was going to occur? We converted that to students and said because of that map where it's platted, it's zoned, it's active, and we use all those different levels, this is the end results of reviewing those developments and trying to project where the most intense number of students are going to show up. So this moves you from a development map to a student projected area, and you can see the physical areas where the most activity right now, at least from the development community, is being seen, and where we're in the future planning, then we're going to project more students in these areas than the other areas of the county.
But
and
this
again,
is over
Northport
35
being on
years.
the next 25.
25 years.
25, sorry.
Yes. Yeah, it's a total over 25 years just to get in general for strategic planning and where your growth's going to occur. You'll see we break that right now. We'll break that into 2 time periods, about halfway, and then the full time period.
Yeah, and again, Northport is unknown at this point. These are the large single managed, I guess, developments, the DRIs or other PUDs and so on.
Although certainly West Villages is in Northport, and that's a very large development.
Right. Yeah.
You're talking about the individual lots.
Right. Yeah, so this is not all development is the point, I guess, yeah.
But no, just kind of the point was kind of that there wasn't any growth or new developments in Northport, and certainly West Villages is a very,
yeah,
very
absolutely.
large.
It also shows that West Villages is the one that's generating the most student generation at 33% versus, Lakewood Ranch at 9% and Palmer Ranch at 4% and Village on the Trail 3%. So definitely, I think that it's important to see this percent of student a generation that some of these places are going to have. And one thing that I shared with Scott when I was talking to him yesterday, we can see all this, but what's the current capacity at some of these schools? And like Sarasota Middle is already busting at the seams, and I know there's some smaller developments going around in there. So I've asked Scott when they get their they're working on their numbers right now of what the current schools are, what their capacity is, and whether they're under or over the capacity, so we can see it by school, because it was kind of hard to see, I found, on these maps, and I don't know if any of you others would like that. When he gets that, we can ask him to send it to all of us.
Yeah.
Because it made it a lot clearer for me to understand what schools we're talking about and where we have openings. And I'm surprised how some of them were already over capacity.
Yeah. So the next few maps, we show each school level. Start with the current conditions, and we look at them by attendance boundaries. We do a comparison of the available capacity in terms of fish versus program. And in each one of these maps, the dark green is where there's most capacity available, light green is some more. As of yellow, you either have no capacity and starting to experience some deficiency, and then orange and red indicate bigger deficiency. And there are the individual capacities are sort of listed on the first slide, but I think on your printout they are covered with the next circles. So in the case of high schools, the current conditions, there are really no issues at this time. If you click, sorry. So this is again our high growth areas, and this is when we circled Northport with a question mark to exactly indicate what you all mentioned here. And then when we go to 2027, which is sort of midpoint, a 12-year period, we start seeing deficiencies definitely in the Venice area. And then if you look at the program capacity, also in the Riverview area. So we start seeing that. Go ahead. So then what we suggested is building at least one high school. And, obviously this is a big picture presentation, but if the location is somewhere between the two districts, maybe there will be two boundaries. Maybe there will be a way to accommodate all these students. But in terms of overall capacity, one high school would be sufficient at that point.
And am I picking up from what you're saying that even though it looks like most of the growth is in the villages that you're talking about, the high school would be, are you assuming that those West Villages students would be districted to Venice now? Which would make Venice the issue.
They are currently the current boundary for the Venice school area, and that's different than the jurisdictional boundaries. But our current Venice area extends to the Myakka River and then north up into Palma Ranch. So if you were to put a school in kind of the central area, you would take the northern part of our current Venice school area and the southern part of the Riverview area and create an area, and that would allow the Myakka River to maintain its position going to the Venice school area. Recognize one of the things that we asked them to do was the Northport community, if something were to change there with the platted lots and it were to develop faster than we can project, because we can't really project that area, there is a second high school site that we currently own in Northport. So we are able to respond to the unknown development that's happening in Northport more quickly than we would be able to respond to other development areas, because we don't own land for a high school site anywhere but the second high school site that we own in Northport.
Although land is a very small cost of
right,
facility.
but we do have the ability to respond somewhat to Northport's question mark. I mean, it's very hard for us to project Northport, because tomorrow people could pull the plat and
Sure.
pull, and we'd be building there.
But I understand we have a site for a high school, a middle school, and 5 elementary schools? Two elementary schools? So it's 5 sites total, not 7. Okay.
So
we have the property for
we have property in
for
Northport.
Northport. Yeah, it's the other areas.
It's the other areas that we've asked them to look at, because those new development areas are the areas that we currently don't have the land bank to respond to growth.
Do we have something in Palmer
Yeah.
Palmer Ranch? Do we have land in Palmer Ranch?
Oh, not in Palmer Ranch. No, I'm sorry. In Palmer Ranch, we had a site, but it has been reverted back to the developer.
Okay.
As we move forward, I think this is important, because when you're putting these plans together, the first thing you do in the next 3 to 5 years is to make sure you have the land, and then you monitor and you decide when to pull a trigger. So if you look at this, what we're saying is you need to deal with a land issue in the next few years, and then based on actually monitoring, that high school is going to have to be dealt with sometime out there. But the key issue here from a strategic planning is you need to deal probably with that land issue short term, in terms of at least getting a feel that that is a reasonable place to do a siting.
So then this slide shows the growth by 2040. So this is including that one high school built around to accommodate 2027 levels. So then again, the Venice area becomes deficient, and so this is a continuing development in the same areas. And then if we add one other school there, then that takes care of it as far as the capacity or the shortfall by 2040. So that's the high schools, 1 to 2 schools. In terms of middle schools, under program capacity, right now just Sarasota attendance boundary seems to have deficiency. Okay. And then again, we have those high growth areas sort of starting from Sarasota going all the way to Venice. By 2027, you have under programmed, you have quite a bit more deficiencies. And again, starting from Sarasota going all the way down to Venice area again. So if we build one middle school by 2027 and we sort of put it again in the middle, that will take care of that deficiency at that point. But then 2040, that school is not sufficient to accommodate new students, so in terms of the Venice attendance boundary. And
I was concerned with the area for middle schools, and it comes down to Sarasota Middle. And there's still some construction going on there. Of course, we don't know when these middle school charter schools keep popping up, but I was surprised to see that there was such a high need in that area. That caught me by surprise. I'm glad that has been pointed out. Sarasota, that it's currently over capacity.
In terms of program capacity.
Program capacity, yeah.
I think we were done with middle schools, right? Yeah.
Yes.
And then, in terms of, so elementary schools, that's the one area that really needs a close-up look, and there's already quite a bit deficiencies right now. There's really countywide. There's really no permanent program capacity left. Like there's nothing in total. Next slide. So by 2027, it's like almost, other than some of the coastal areas, the whole county becomes red. And on these maps, I think I forgot to mention, but we took out your conservation land, so that's why the shape of the county is a little different. That's the grayed out area. So that's more developable land with the current zoning. It could always change, but right now, so just so you know.
That's really important because when we work in most counties, when the first time we do this, they say, I never realized my county's shaped like this. This is the shape of your county that's going to get developed. And all that in white is not proposed for development. So you get a sense that it's not quite as big as you think it is, and there's not as many acres as you think it is, and the locational issues become easier to visualize.
Not proposed yet.
Yeah,
right,
well,
right,
I had some employees who live in Manatee County that says some ranchers out there that over a long period of time are people on land that may have a different opinion about whether it's going to eventually
Obviously,
get
the
developed.
middle chunk of that is Mayaca Park,
Yeah.
and Oscar Scheer Park,
Right.
and the county conservation.
Most of
area.
it's probably pretty good shape. At some point in time, there's going to be some pressure out there, but probably not. Hopefully, in the next 5 to 10 years, we're probably all right.
I knew something was off because that's my district. And I know there's more than this.
Yeah.
When we get the updated numbers, when Scott goes through them, I like these ones that show the current conditions without the high growth
Bubbles.
over the numbers.
Right.
Because I find it helpful, except that
You can't see. Yeah.
can't read it.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay. So by 2027, then our estimate is if we add 5 new elementary schools, it will take care of the deficiency. It will take about that number of elementary schools. And now, if we were able to use the fish capacity, that would go down to 2. So that's the range. But Fish at 100%.
Yeah.
Yeah.
You want to make that.
Yeah. It's the fish by the way that DOE defines it at 100%. So yeah. So the program is the 85.
So
Yeah.
if we were, the point there is if we used a level of service standard of fish at 85%, which would account for that utilization, then it would be look more like the program capacity. That the fish numbers that we've been showing throughout this is fish at 100% or 105%.
And then with those schools, again, by 2040, there's still some congestion, including those schools. And so adding, I think, 2 more schools, you still have continuing development going on, eating up the capacity. So then by 2040, at a high end, like 7 schools will be needed.
And that's another one where I looked and I said, geez, in 2040 we'll have 7 elementary schools and we'll have a system capacity of 30 and 60. Are those numbers?
Yeah.
You understand, these are your planning projections. When we come back, we may pull some of these down, especially the first 10 years. These are kind of what everybody's using, what the transportation planning people are using, what Beaver's using.
That's what it
So
takes.
we're going to do some
permanent
pluses and
capacity.
minuses in terms of the first 5 or 10 years when we make our projections.
That available capacity that you're seeing 30 to 60 is the permanent capacity after we build all these schools. So that just means there's students coming right behind it. Then you'll be short pretty quickly. Again, this doesn't assume any portable use. This looks at each attendance zone separately. Like it doesn't assume any redistricting. So there may be some efficiencies otherwise, but it's just, again, like Steve said, for planning purposes, it's nice to plan for it and then not have to face that level of.
When you look at the portables, and I noticed that red area on elementary schools and the yellow up there, about Goshen, did you count the portables on Goshen currently, or
no.
because there's a lot of portables right
Yes.
there, so that if those portables were counted, that orange might go to.
Because they're not permanent capacity. The reason I came back, I wanted to talk about the portable issue a little bit. Part of the reason that we didn't assume portables in this is because what portables do, in my mind anyway, is provide you the flexibility to get to the next school. We haven't perceived portables as a way to provide permanent capacity to kids. It's a way. So remember, you can't obligate tax dollars until you can prove the need. So the DOE is going to say, okay, show me you have 800 more kids and then we'll let you build a new school. How do you get there? You get there through portables. So our portables would be your flexibility to get to the point where you open that next school, not a part of your permanent student station count. Does that make sense?
It's a transitional use.
Right.
Unfortunately, it does make sense, but it's not followed because a charter school can build without there being a need for capacity, where a traditional public school cannot build unless we can prove the need for capacity. So that's kind of puts us at an unfair position.
One of the reasons we don't use portable capacity, Ms. Brown, is because when we adopted our level of service standard through our interlocal back in the mid-late 2000s, we adopted permanent program capacity. That is our adopted level of service standard. So we don't look at the portables because it's not a part of our adopted level of service standard.
So we haven't looked at the portables at Pineview. And are there portables at Sarasota Middle? How many?
Yeah.
Don't hold me to the number 9. There's not as many as there were. The schools that are big, and when you say we haven't looked at portables, they're certainly on our radar relative to capacity versus enrollment. We're talking about in terms of strategic projection, we haven't reviewed portables as a part of your capacity. They're on our radar for other purposes all the time. Pineview has the most. I think Goshen is second and a distant second. Garden is up there, probably around 20. So, but we're certainly aware of those. And if you look at your 5-year plan right now, there's even some money in the 5-year plan to address the issue of capacity at those schools that have permanent portable issues.
And
not related to the growth conversation at all, just related to accommodating students.
And there's 3 schools that we actually did not include as part of this study because they aren't, because they're special districted schools, so they're not a part of our normal districting, and that's Pineview, Bayhaven, and Polytech. So those three schools weren't even a part of this equation. So when you talk about Pineview, it wasn't something we looked at because that's a special districted school. It's not a school that students are permanently districted to.
I think also the board has to think about operational costs that you incur when you build a new school. Custodial, those staff members that are a part of any new school. So you want timing is everything. You don't want to have all of a sudden we're going in deficit mode because we're building a new school and we have these additional costs. And it's been a while since we've built a new school, and you might have forgotten that always is a big bump in terms of the expenditures in a district once you build a new school. So you have to have that right balance of having the students there, demonstrating the need that you can then build and absorb the other costs that go along anytime you open up a new building.
But going back to something that Lori said about we haven't built any new schools, but we have built several replacement schools, and it's not quite part of this particular conversation, but it's certainly part of the whole capital budget. When you look at that, we have built new schools that are more efficient, and I think personally that our existing school buildings in the county are probably in as good a shape as they've been in 20 or 30 years.
Absolutely. I think a combination of growth that didn't drive all of our capital dollars to new facilities that we could invest in current, and the board's willingness to even borrow and build at a time when the costs were low. I think that combination has really served us well. I think in terms of the quality of our facilities and quality in terms of operational costs not being as costly as you might find in older buildings, that combination really serves this district well. So we're really in a good position, and if we plan strategically and carefully, I think we can continue that trend, and that's what this is dialogue and this planning is all about.
And of course, the other issue that we have is the 1.5 or 1.5 mils versus the 2 mils when it comes
Sure,
to
where the
government.
revenues dipped down. Absolutely.
We had 2 mils during the last building time. We don't have 2 mils.
You're absolutely right.
What's going on now?
And I think we'll discuss the funding of this plan more in August, but just to give a sense for the level of investment, right now just a ballpark estimate is about $35,000 per student station. So it would take about $30 million to build an elementary school, about $50 million for middle school, and $75 million or so for high school. So just to make the point that's, if we build this range of schools that we show you today, it would be about $275 to $460 million, or which translates into about $10 to $20 million a year that district will have to set aside, or at least work towards. And
just for clarification, when you talk about that, you're including the land cost, or you just when we look at these numbers, is
yes.
that including land cost?
Yes. It's all capital costs, but not operational. Yeah.
I guess again, in summary, the good news is that you're not growing as fast as other counties. Your student generation rates lower, and we've got counties that are built a whole lot of schools and they're in really bad shape. So you got three legs there that you really, if you think these numbers are big, they're 3 to 4 times this size for some of our other clients. So these are big numbers, and it's very expensive, but it's very manageable compared to some experiences.
And again, going forward, some of the considerations is again portables, redistricting, and then we also wanted to get some input. Anything else you'd like to see between now and August that's added to the analysis? Yeah, sure. Why not?
Before you leave that slide, Kathy, that question mark on there is an important one, I think, to all of us. And I know you haven't had a lot of time to digest what you heard today, but are there any kind of glaring gaps in, and surely you asked for one already, and I think what we talked about yesterday is an individual by school capacity versus enrollment. So, and we have that. In fact, we looked at a dated version of it yesterday with Mrs. Brown, but is there anything else as we walk through this whole conversation about growth and the impact of that on our capacity and ultimately how we pay for it, is there anything else that on the growth side of the conversation that would help you in your deliberations?
Is this a good time to look at the interlocal agreements that we have with the other counties that surround us?
I could, if you haven't seen it in a while, I could certainly send it to you.
I
I
would
could
like
send you
that.
ours, and if you wanted to get those from some of the counties around us, those that have interlocal agreements on school facility planning, I think, Kathy, could we get those through the planning? Yeah, we could get you those.
I know one big question mark in this whole conversation. I don't know how you even try to plug it in there, but how do you try to deal with charter schools? Because they, at least over the last 10 years or so, they have absorbed the vast majority of our new student population. How do you plug that in?
Now, our generation rates that we use are traditional schools generation only. We didn't include charter schools or any other.
I understand that, but like I said, if we had, over the next 10 years, had 4 new charter schools that absorbed 2,000 students, that would be
right.
Would come off of these numbers that we have. Basically.
We've actually set up a model where we can change the rates. We can go in there, the 0.22 to 0.2 or whatever. And what we found all over the state is that charter schools all went up very quickly, and they're tending to level. It's a certain type and a certain condition that occurred. And so what we can do is we can tinker with what if the charter schools pull up more or less, and then show you, because there's no way to predict it absolutely, but we can show you whether it has a significant, how much the impact might be. The range of impact would be the question, is what would it take the charter schools to do before you wouldn't have to build a school?
Now, did you say that was factored in somehow in the student?
All these generation rates she's showing you is the total students showing up at the public school system.
Traditional schools.
And the charter school students are not in these rates.
Now, the other thing is when you look at the trend, it seems like they are going up on average like 1% a year higher. They are capturing 1% more of the total students, and they need to apply to even be billed, I think, 2 years prior to their opening. So between those two, that gives you a little bit of room to plan for them. Like if you have some applications coming online, you'll know there'll be one, and that helps. And then if you accommodate maybe 1 or 2% going to them, that's another way of creating a.
Well, it would be nice if you could figure some way to show them the map and say, well, you see where we need.
but I did see some private schools listed on one of your maps, where little icons that showed private schools.
We may show where they're located, but we don't have the students in the numbers.
Right, but that also may be, may impact us at some point.
That program capacity, that in the number of students enrolled, when you show when they're over program capacity, and you're on that list, you don't account for the number of portables.
In the big spreadsheet that we were looking at yesterday, there were actually columns that were labeled permanent fish, permanent program, total fish, and total program.
So the total would include the portables.
Yeah.
Thank you.
So as you're looking at, Goshio is at, and don't hold me to the number, but Goshio is at 130% of their capacity. How are you accommodating the kids? It's with portables that don't show up in the permanent capacity, but they do show up in total capacity.
But we're not going to include Pineview in this.
Well, from a strategic planning perspective relative to where the growth is happening, how schools respond to that, no. And really 2 reasons. Number one is they're not a districted school. Kids can come from anywhere in the county to Pineview. Kathy also mentioned Bayhaven and Suncoast Poly in a similar place. And second, those schools have essentially enrollment caps. So we know how many kids they're going to take.
The other school that's not in here is Oak Park, because they're the same thing, the same reason.
In terms of the next steps and schedule, in July we'll submit a draft report. In August there's a workshop. I think at that point we'll also bring the financial side of this plan. And I think there's a public hearing scheduled for September 15, and October would be the final report and the final school board action on this plan.
Now, when you're talking about the financial aspects that you're going to show us in August, there's this thing that nobody's talking about, but it's the elephant in the room. Is that going to be part of that August discussion?
Yes.
Okay. The way we've talked about maybe addressing that is bringing to the board kind of a 30,000-foot view of a couple things. If we take, for example, a 10-year look, we say over 10 years at your current revenue streams, no PICO, 1.5 mils on the capital side, and no impact fee, for example. That's your current revenue stream. and then you look over that same 10-year period what your capital need is, and that's going to identify a gap. And I think the conversation is about, and how do you accommodate that gap? So that's the context that we'll put that conversation in.
And just to be clear, since I opened that up, obviously we talked about last year about a number that's defensible if the board chose to go in that direction. Is that going to be part of the August discussion? Thank you.
Are you going to include in the discussion if in fact the legislature says, "Oh, we're going to let you raise two mills capital again"?
If that were to happen, you can bet we'll adapt.
I do want to bring up the choice option, because I know you guys have worked with other districts. Have you ever added that into the planning part of it as far as the calculation? Or is there data that we have as a district as we've seen, our growth expectation and then what's been offset by charter schools opening? Is that something that we can use to kind of forecast?
I think she's got the statewide data. What we can do is provide you with your trends and the statewide trends and see how they're trending, and then show you how we're using that for the sensitivity analysis. Because the real bottom line is that charter school, if we conclude you almost absolutely need to build one elementary school in the next 5 years, so we just kind of include that, will the charter school stop that or not?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's kind of your big discussion. Do you need to have at least one site and build one $35 million asset? And is the charter school going to move that up to 6th year, the 7th year, or the 8th year?
Mm-hmm.
And we'll give you an analysis of that, and we'll give you some trends. But I felt comfortable that the types of things we'll present to you, you can hopefully just make some decisions that, as a minimum, you need to get a site and start planning for it. And the best thing that could happen for you is you start generating that revenue, and it's forestalled for a couple of years, and then you spend it. So we'll show you some. The main thing in this planning is to give you some sense of strategic decisions you can make in terms of keeping your life reasonable, and not saying here's a crystal ball with these exact projections.
Well, I think another thing that clouds that is if the legislature says there are no boundaries, Manatee, DeSoto, Polk, Charlotte, you can send all your kids to those nice new fancy schools in Sarasota, and hey, we'll give you $500 to drive them there. And you don't know how to put those numbers in there either. Right. And that's beyond me.
I guess you'll be dealing with the numbers that you can predict.
Yeah, and if they've given you a sense of almost at least an orders of magnitude, I'm in general, I feel comfortable with, again, your growth rate, your current condition of your schools, the investment you're not having to make, and your student generation rate. We're going to show you numbers that should be manageable. I mean, compared to what some people are having to suffer through, and then you just have to decide how you want to manage those numbers and what risk you want to take, or where you want to start creating that revenue flow to minimize your risk of being in a position where you needed a school and you either have to go bond it or do something almost on an emergency basis. So that's, when you do planning, that's what we want to do is, the risk, some logical discussions, give you a plan to monitor and be able to pull triggers at the right time.
I think a lot of those unknowns that we get when we make those plans are something, a lot of people say, why do you get paid on a school board versus, I come from a district that doesn't. Those other districts are small neighborhood. It might just be, the city of Naperville and in Illinois, a suburb of Chicago. And
I've worked
all
there.
they have to do is look at the school in their suburb and only the students in their suburb. They don't have to talk about the schools from across the way, and they don't have to talk about some of these other things. And they can set their own rates. Their millage rates are entirely up to them. So there's a lot of differences that we have to, and we've got a much larger district to look at. And glad we have experts that we can bring in and get get some input.
Going back to the bonding issue, I know that from past experience there are maximums that either by statute or by keeping a good credit rating, you can only have so much a percentage of your revenues going to pay for a bond or debt. Are we going to have are we going to know that? Are we going to have that be able to look at?
We can certainly include that. You have a fair amount of debt service headroom available today, in part because the revenue side of the equation is going up, and in part because this year, yes, at the last capital this year we paid off the cops that built Venicel, Philippi Shores, Wilkinson, and so that was about a $6 million a year debt payment that is now gone. So you have headroom. So that's part of the equation, is how does debt fit into, as Steve just suggested, you have some decisions to make. One of them is how does debt fit into that overall equation.
Because going back to the 1.5 versus 2 mils, we don't have the ability to raise capital dollars quite to the extent that we were able to back both during the last run-up and also before the law was changed, before that was changed. So
When I talk to people about the capital budget, I always oversimplify it by saying it's a pretty simple equation. It's the tax roll base times the millage rate. And if you think about what's happened over the last, since 2007 or thereabouts, is both of those things have dramatically declined. The millage rate got cut by 25% from 2.0 to 1.5, and the tax roll base fell from 60 billion plus to 40 billion or something like that. So, and if you see, maybe one of the things we should put in that presentation is what your total collections have been over time, because you see a spike in the run-up as construction was booming, and then this huge bathtub that you're now beginning to pull your way out of. But at our peak, we were about just under $180 million annually on the capital side, and I think what Al has shown you today is in the kind of mid-80 million range, so about 50% of where you once were.
When you give us those numbers, I mean, if we're going to be looking out 25 years, I know that's going to be difficult to judge what the property values will be, but are you going to be looking at some sort of an estimate of what we would be able to collect over there, or how far out into the future you're going to go with that? I mean, because if we're going to be looking at stations we're going to have to do, and you're generating those, I mean, it also generates an increase in property values and thereby dollars that are coming in.
From the budgetary side, and Mr. Widener and I have had a number of conversations about this. What we've talked about is maybe a 10-year look, because much beyond that it gets pretty fuzzy. I think if you stay inside 5 years, it's almost too short a time frame to plan, given it takes a year to design and 2 years to build. That's 3 years your capital plan once you own the property and make the decision.
I think it's fuzzy now. It gets long-haired when we get out there.
It gets fuzzier and longer, right? The other thing we've talked about then is building in some, and I would look to him to do this because it's certainly his wheelhouse, but what are the assumptions that you use to project those revenue streams from 2015 through 2025? We'll work very closely with budget to come up with the revenue side of that equation.
Are there any questions about the data that was presented to you today? Are you comfortable with where you are so far?
We're 62nd in student growth in the state. It's the only time I can say that we're toward the bottom of the patch. But looking at Orange being, very high up, as well as Osceola and some of the other counties, I think it gives us and I've talked to several developers who've said, we're going to really be moving forward with baby boomer homes, and we really aren't going to find that many, and of course, that many people coming to this county that are younger. And I think that still holds true and applies, but I think that, we've only just begun to see people who want to move here, and it's a big secret. I was downtown yesterday, and I thought, well, it should be no traffic. I think we've come to the year-round people being here. It's not quite as big a difference between winter and summer anymore.
Well, I also noticed driving around, I mean, there's just that vacant land. I mean, that just looked like a lot or two. I mean, it might have even had a house on it. That house is now gone, and all of a sudden there's this development moving in. I'm like, whoa, I didn't know there was room for that. And I'm seeing that in a lot of different places with development going up that I wouldn't have thought there would have been room for something like that before. And, you think, oh, well, downtown we're going to get the people, and down south we're going to get the people, and, east of the trail, east of the interstate, we're going to get some people. But I'm, seeing what they call that infill kind of stuff, and it's a little bit surprising. But driving down the road in Tampa when we saw those huge apartment complexes going up for the younger people near the businesses, the offices, and the shopping malls. It's looking a little more like New York City in spaces in Tampa now. That just 10 years ago when we were going to the conference, it just didn't look like that. Hold our breath.
We've shared this presentation with the other planning directors and planners across the county, and one of the comments that they made was Jeff Schrum, who's the new planning director for the city of Venice, he's been there about a year and a half now. He made the comment, he came from where the villages are, and he said, when they did the villages, they said, we don't need any schools here. And the first thing they needed was schools, because where people go to retire, there go workers to work, to provide them services and families. Yes, we're not in the same situation as other counties, but we still have to recognize, and I think this report does a pretty good job of explaining that we aren't going to have no children.
Scott, and I'm not sure if this is a question to you, or perhaps to Ellery, or even to Mitzi. One of the things that did pass in this special session, was with the safety, getting to schools and the transportation, walkable conditions. And I mean, I can point. I mean, it just scares me going up Proctor Road. Those kids that are walking, or you look at that Honorary and Ashton corner. It just scares me that they're not safe right now, and now when we're putting in new homes and stuff, how is that going to impact us, either by adding to transportation or to the sidewalks, or is it the county's responsibility to put those sidewalks in? And is there a move to look at those safe walking conditions in view of this new law that's passed? I don't think it's been signed yet, or has it? But
you asked a lot of questions in that. Let me try to address them each. The responsibility rests with the jurisdiction where the roads are. The board's responsibility is to say, we believe that this particular area fits the criteria of safe walking condition. Jurisdiction, tell us how you're going to deal with this. And I would tell you that if you look at the definition of safe walking conditions, first of all, it only applies to K6. But there aren't a whole lot of areas in our county that fit that criteria today, and what you just hit on is probably the very top one. It's that Proctor Road between McIntosh and Honoré, where you've got big deep
Ashton
ditches.
And Honoré.
Yeah, that whole area. Yes, it's on our radar. In fact, it's interesting. Rob Lewis, who's the legislative affairs guy from Sarasota County government, he and I have kind of been tracking that legislation together, in part because that area is in the county's jurisdiction. So our responsibility, the board's responsibility, is simply to flag it to the local government. This is an area we believe is unsafe. We meet with them and agree or disagree on whether it is unsafe, and then it's kind of on them to say, how are you going to deal with this, and where do we put it in your 5-year capital plan?
Is I don't know if now is the time, but I mean, I would really like to hear about what the overall look is on the county in view of that, if that bill passes, perhaps sometime in the not too distant future. I know you're busy for the next several months on this. Well, perhaps at the next joint meeting that we have, when we have a joint meeting, to have that presentation, so that we can all look at it together.
Sure.
And I think if you wanted to look at the county as a whole, you'd want to include all the jurisdictions. Although I think if Ellery Gerard were sitting here, I think he would tell you that there aren't a whole lot of areas in the county that fit the definition of not only fit the definition of unsafe, because it's real specific. It's the kind of road, it's the speed limit, it's whether there's a sidewalk or a safe grassy walking area, and then the ages of the kids that are using that walking area. When you put all that together, there aren't a lot of places where we have kids that fit that definition. So,
well,
I noticed one of the things that we are doing is we are having more bus stops than we did initially because of that very problem. And Proctor Road happens to be one of those places where we have more bus stops. Because I asked about this because I was concerned, because I drive Proctor Road all the time. And so that's how we've compensated for it.
We can certainly work with our planning partners and the transportation department to make sure that we have a presentation about this issue at the January convocation of governments. It's not too early to start thinking of ideas for that for that meeting.
Anything else? Thank you very much. We'll look forward to August. We're adjourned.